Okay. We're all set.
Can you hear me?
We hear you, yes. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
I
great.
can't,
So
but I can hear you.
welcome back. We are now beginning our third plenary session. This plenary session is about the 20 years of celebration of the Global Development Network, but in this particular session, in the context of the research and policy advisors, we're going to begin the session with some introductory remarks from Professor Joe Stiglitz, whom, as you know, was instrumental in the creation of GDN 20 years ago when he was chief economist of the World Bank. Remember that GDN started with the support of the World Bank as an initiative of the World Bank to bridge research between the North and the South, or between the advanced and the developing economies. So, without further ado, Joe, why don't you begin? I think you will speak for about 20 minutes. I don't know if you can see, but we are in this beautiful Congress Hall, which was the Bundestag, and it's just a fantastic place to have this conference. So welcome, and glad to have you participating.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm really sorry I can't be there for this occasion, especially because I remember so vividly our first meeting in 1999. Before beginning, I want to say a word in memory of Guillermo Perry, whose sudden passing is a loss to all of us. He was a great economist, a great leader, a great friend. He was a co-author. He was a colleague of mine at the World Bank, where he was chief economist of Latin America. And I worked very closely with him over many years, both at the World Bank and subsequently. And I've remained a good friend of his for 2 decades since. I also want to acknowledge the leadership that he provided to GDN, and he will be greatly missed. Well, this afternoon, I want to set the scene for the founding of the Global Development Network, as well as talk about the greater challenges that we face today. The bank was, at that time, just in the process of reviewing itself, rethinking itself as a knowledge bank, reflecting both my own ideas and that of Jim Wolfison, who was the president of the bank at the time, on what made for successful development. The bank was founded on the idea that what separated developing from developed countries was a shortage of capital, a lack of funds, and that was why in the early days of the bank, the focus was on projects. When that didn't succeed in delivering the kind of development that had been hoped, the bank went on to thinking about policies, programs of structural adjustment. It was a big change for the bank. It provided budgetary support under a whole variety of conditionalities. When that didn't work, the bank went on to start talking about other issues like institutions. And what both Jim and I thought was that what was critical was knowledge for development. What separated developing countries from developed countries was not just a gap in resources, but a gap in knowledge. And in the first World Development Report, WDR, that I initiated after I became the chief economist of the World Bank, we focused on the role of knowledge in development. But it raised the question, what kind of knowledge was relevant, and what did it mean for the bank to be a knowledge bank? What was clear is one needed both global, from knowledge, experiences from around the world, but also local knowledge, an understanding of the distinct circumstances that countries found themselves in. That was why I entitled my talk 20 years ago, Scan Globally, Reinvent Locally, Knowledge Infrastructure and the Localization of Knowledge. As I reread that talk that I gave 20 years ago, I thought it hit on a number of the central themes that GDN has focused on in the subsequent 20 years. One of the reasons I focused on this scan globally but reinvent locally is that I was very convinced that one wanted to avoid the one-size-fits-all policies that have characterized the Washington Consensus and policies that I had railed against in my book, Globalization and Its Discontents. There are a couple of other premises that were important in our thinking at the time. One of them is that democracy was a value in its own right, but also the best way to deliver sustained economic development. One might be lucky, as in the case of Singapore, in having a benevolent dictator, but more than likely, one would wind up with a failure seen so much elsewhere around the world. The success of democracy, or whatever form of government, required knowledge and deliberation. It required local knowledge based on global understandings. And this was especially true in an era of globalization with global interactions. But that knowledge had to be built locally. And we felt we needed to build institutions that would develop that knowledge and share that knowledge more broadly. And that was why we thought it was so important to strengthen local think tanks and strengthen the bonds between those local think tanks and each other and with think tanks in the North. At the time, we were fighting many battles, and many of those battles continue. Colonialism had been followed by neocolonialism, accompanied by a kind of paternalism, which was inconsistent with the very idea of democratic self-governance. A was unfortunately accompanied by innumerable conditions. As I said in my lecture, we wanted to put countries in the driver's seat. To quote, if the developing countries are really to be in the driver's seat, they have to have the capacity to analyze the often difficult economic issues which they face. Local researchers combining the knowledge of local conditions, including knowledge of local political and social structures, with a learning derived from global experience, provides the best prospects for deriving policies which are both effective and engender broad-based support. That is why locally based research institutions are so important. One part of my speech, as I reread it, seemed particularly poignant in today's world: the threat to free speech and intellectual independence. We live in a world with authoritarian leaders who do not want their questionable ideas to be questioned, who denigrate the Enlightenment institutions which have led to the advancement of our standards of living. And those ideas of the Enlightenment help explain why we have a higher standard of living and longer lives than we did 200 years ago. If you look at the data for hundreds of years, there was no increase in standards of living until the latter part of the 18th century. And then first in Europe and North America and a few other places around the world, standards of living started to rise very rapidly. And in the last 80 years, similar things have happened in many developing countries. All of that increase in standard of living, the most important, was based on knowledge. Knowledge about the physical world, science, and knowledge about human nature, knowledge about social organization and how complex societies can govern themselves. The concern is that these authoritarian leaders, demagogues, have been attacking the foundations of our epistemology, our truth-gathering, assessing institutions, our think tanks, as well as our education, media, and judiciary. I wrote then that we should not be surprised at either the vehemence of the subtle or the subtlety with which these institutions and the individuals within them may be attacked, or at attempts to undermine their credibility, especially so by governments whose political legitimacy is questioned. Those remarks that I made 20 years ago seem particularly applicable in today's world. I wrote that in a period which was, I spoke then at a time which was shortly after Francis Fukuyama had declared the end of history. Liberal democracies and market economies would, he predicted, triumph. That view seems almost quaint, certainly naive, in the era in which we live. But in some ways, we are where we are today in this troubled time, partly because we did not think deeply enough. Again, as I said in my talk, we in the ideas business should never forget the power of ideas. Neoliberalism was a powerful idea. It grabbed the world. It grabbed the economics profession, but it was flawed in so many ways. It ignored market failures and imperfection. It ignored institutions that paid insufficient attention to learning and knowledge. It ignored concerns about the distribution of income. It argued for a set of policies that failed in both developing and developed countries. It gave blinders to economists. They argued that empirical evidence supported their ideas. They often claimed that the policy recommendations were based on evidence-based research. When the 2008 financial crisis arrived, a crisis that was inconsistent with their models, the models said it couldn't happen. They provided a whole array of excuses. Some said no model could explain a once-in-a-500-year flood. But it was a flood, a crisis, which was created out of the very thinking that was the foundation of those models. Some talked about rollover crises, as if those were outside the model. But rollover crises are crises generated by credit rationing. Again, a phenomena that should have been in the model, but was excluded. Most of the proponents of those models refused to admit the fundamental flaws in their models. Groupthink exists within academia just as it does outside of academia. And we have an especially strong responsibility to keep our horizons wide. The good news is that within many branches of economics, within many think tanks, even before the financial crisis, those horizons have been widening, opening up. Behavioral economics, for instance, undermined the rational actor model. Game theory gave us tools to deal with pervasively uncompetitive markets. Information theory had provided tools for dealing with the consequences of risk and imperfections of information. Yet the remarkable thing is that mainstream macroeconomic models ignored all of these and many others. There's one more warning that I should raise that was raised very forcefully in the very useful paper by Pierre that it circulated in conjunction with this conference. He said, we should not be surprised that either the vehemence or he warned about the use of knowledge by and these institutions by special interests. He said two pretentious consequences are worth mentioning. First, various lobbies and interest groups have used science to advance their own interests within a democratic debate with very imperfect information. Second, the social failures, unequal growth, and increasingly environmental failures risk to discredit science as a source of inspiration. We are far from the Enlightenment ideal. And he went on to say, as a result of all the failures that I've just described, a large number of individuals, at least in advanced countries, have lost trust in academia, threatening to end the era of enlightenment, which has been so instrumental in raising welfare over the last 2 centuries. When science does no longer guide beliefs, societies turn to obscurantism, and this is particularly ominous. And yet, science does produce useful knowledge. And academic knowledge is crucial at a time when our societies have to deal with new global challenges that call for deeper understandings and informed action. Mobilizing science for development requires the highest political commitment. Hopefully, we are now in a new era. For instance, the Institute of New Economic Thinking has successfully promoted new research, new models with success among young scholars that had not been previously indoctrinated in some of the older ideas. And as the reference I've given to behavioral economics, game theory, information economics, there are many exciting strands to be pursued, all of which are important for development. This has to be done in every arena. Knowledge is so complex that no single methodology is going to be able to deliver the knowledge that we are going to need for development. Let me sort of illustrate that by reference to the Nobel Prize that was awarded this week. The prize for RCTs was an important development. The idea, of course, was previous in medicine. It was even in economics in the 1970s with negative income tax and other experiments. But making it part of the workhorse methodology in economics is an important contribution. But while it is very important, in development, we have to, the challenges of development are so large, we have to keep our horizons wide. For instance, the most important successes in moving people out of poverty was based on good macroeconomic performance, the enormously high rates of growth in East Asia. These include well-formulated industrial policies, policies that were involved in closing the knowledge gap. These are examples of policies on which you really can't do well-designed random control. We don't have enough countries where we can say, okay, this country will do industrial policies and some other country won't. We can sometimes do random control experiments with one specific provision, one specific strategy. The consequence of the absence of ability to do these kinds of random controls is that we will have difficulties in ensuring identification. We will have to make judgment. But even in areas of microeconomics, Angus Deaton has repeatedly reminded us of the limitations of RCTs, the problems, for instance, of external validity. Microcredit failures, for instance, while microcredit regimes were extraordinarily successful in Bangladesh, there was bankruptcy in India. The RTCs that were done in the context of microcredit really didn't give us much insight into what eventually led to the largest microcredit bankruptcy. They gave us insights into a lot of details and fine-tuning, but they missed the big issues, importance of nonprofits, the importance of various kinds of social capital, the kinds of ideas that Muhammad Yunus had raised when he had actually started microcredit, and the kinds of notions that have been raised in what's sometimes called the second strand of behavioral economics, in which I've been involved in recent years. At the same time, there are really hard problems in which RTC can give us important insights. For instance, one of the big challenges is going to be controlling birth rates and designing experiments that will give us insights into the most effective ways of doing so are going to be enormously valuable. I want to conclude my remarks this afternoon by rereading the words I wrote in ending my talk 19 years ago. We are embarking here on an enterprise of potentially immense importance, creating a new global institution, the Global Development Network, devoted to enhancing democratic governance at the local, national, regional, and global levels, to promoting dialogue and to strengthening the processes of consensus building. Underlying all of these efforts is the pursuit of knowledge, global knowledge about general principles, local knowledge about how those general principles play out in the multitude of local contexts over our vast globe, knowledge based on well-constructed theories and meticulous analysis of empirical evidence. I believe it's only through such open discussion and active research that we shall break free from the chains of ignorance, the traps of poverty, the grips of elites, and the blinders of ideology and self-interest in our quest for a more democratic, equitable, and sustainable transformation of our societies. And what I said then, I believe is even truer today. It's even more important in the current world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. This is very useful. It really helps frame this conversation. We have 30 more minutes. We have 5 speakers. We have lots of questions, lots of ideas about what's next, what the next 20 years are going to look like. What would be the role of GDN in that process? Where do we stand today relative to the ideas that created this network? So we have two, the current president, the former president of GDN, a long-standing board member. We have someone who was part of the creation of GDN in the process of bringing new talent from developing countries. And we have someone who's at the core of the research and educational agenda by running currently a university. So let me begin with Diane.
Oh.
Let me begin with you. As you probably know, Diane directs the Central European University. It's been part of these group of universities that have formed GDN. A number of activities have taken place at CEU. So I'd like to basically begin this conversation with your thoughts about this, about how is the process in which how do you see this process in which we're engaged now?
Okay, thank you very much. And I've got one quick correction. I am not the rector of Central European Union. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Policy. And I just joined 3 months ago. And I will actually come to my presentation. I do have a PowerPoint presentation. It's only 4 slides, I promise. But I thought, I dread the after lunch slot, and I thought some pictures would be good when everybody's having jet lag kick in. I was looking over the GDN website last night, and there were a couple of words that struck me that were a little bit different from when the GDN was established. And the original motto was better research, better policy, better world. That was quite some time ago. And I see that to today, it's local research for better lives. And what I want to do today in my next 3 slides is actually talk about the global and bring in an additional dimension to the global. I'm not throwing away the local at all, that's still very important, but I think there's something additional that we can look at. So I want to bring it back in the global, and then second, I want to talk about an old concept that has been revived, and this is the notion of epistocracy. It's an old concept from Greek political thought. It's often put in opposition to democracy. It does not need to be, but it's something that I think we are going to hear a lot more about over the next decade. And then finally, I want to talk about academic freedom, which is something that Joe Stiglitz was also talking about as well. Okay, so bringing back in the global. The GDN has changed over time, and it does have this strong focus on building local capacity. But I think one of the things that has happened over the past 20 years is that the strong emphasis that was so noticeable at the turn of the millennium on the need to deliver and to finance global public goods, this has been important in actually fueling new kinds of policy making, but also the development of a new architecture of transnational governance. So we already have a lot of international organizations, but there have also been a variety of innovations in governance with different types of global public-private partnerships, many more global policy networks, and this has implications, I think, that go beyond scanning globally. These new governance innovations, like I said, global public-private partnerships or global dialogues like the World Economic Forum in Davos, they're important domains for decision-making and policy development these days. Now, these are also very difficult venues to access. Difficult venues for developing country researchers, actors, and policymakers to access. So what I am suggesting here is that local capacity also needs to be built so that it is possible for developing countries and the actors, the policy actors in developing countries, to be able to participate on an equal footing in these elite and relatively rarefied venues. Second, this word epistocracy. It means rule by the knowers. And I'd like to suggest that local capacity is good and it's necessary, but expert authority in the making of global and regional policies helps create a new elite. Now, in a national context, there are institutions that are very good in keeping in check, if you like, rule by knowers. Democracy is a very important counterweight. But I would suggest, because there aren't democratic institutions at global and regional levels of governance and policy making, they are developing, but they're relatively unformed. Because there aren't those strong institutions in transnational governance, this is a domain where experts have greater input, greater sway, greater capacity to persuade and to inform policy to a greater extent than those that are based in city, local, or national levels of participation. And this is because in transnational governance, there is no electorate. There is no such thing as a global citizenry, even though it is a bit of a buzzword. So everyday people, I think, are sometimes justified in holding distrust of experts. They often do see experts as just another elite imposing their will on them unaccountably. So I think it's necessary to treat populist nationalism seriously as coming from a place that is valid, and it provides a form of, or a means of way of building in self-reflection about the roles of experts.
Okay.
1 minute, okay? So experts, people like us, are part of the problem. So finally, this is close to me, personal. It's also personal for Jerry, who's a visiting professor at CEU. CEU is being pushed out of Hungary by an illiberal government. For me, it's symptomatic of wider trends, and Joe Stiglitz, too, touched upon these kinds of issues. And I will conclude, because I don't think I need to say much about academic freedom. It is something that is very relevant to the GDN. But I will conclude by saying that when I was on the GDN governing body, at the time when there were discussions about which city the GDN would be located in, Istanbul in Turkey was a very strong contender for that host city. And I think GDN would be in a very different situation today if it was not New Delhi and the political culture of India that it benefits from.
Well, thank you very much. Kondoker, you are a living testimony of what GDN is about. You participated in some of the research projects. You now work for IFC. Based on your own experience, what are your thoughts about the role and what's ahead for GDN?
Thank you. First of all, I must say that it's an honor to sit in this panel, and I'm glad that I'm able to share my story and to comment on that question in the next few minutes. So you've all heard today about the bird's eye view of how things are being done, what's the outlook. But let me take you back and reflect on a time which was 2011 when I worked with GDN on a global research policy project. Now this was an agriculture policy project of a big scale funded by the Gates Foundation, and I was one of the researchers there. And so we started off this workshop in London, my first day, and we were all getting together the local experts came in from all over the world, the global experts were there. We had 2 days of intense discussion on how to shape up the policies in agriculture in these target countries. And after 2 days of heavy discussion, I reached out to a team advisor and I said, is this realistic? Are we going to have an impact on the policy making from the research output? And he said to me at that time, Kondoker, yes, the research output is important, but so is the journey. And I did nod and I pretended that I understood what he meant. But at that time I didn't. But in the next 1.5 years, I did understand. So as a researcher, as we went to these different countries, as we discussed with local policymakers, local researchers, shared our findings, got to know about their findings, the change was happening at that point. So we often see the research output and the impact it has on policy as an end product. But it's a continuum. It starts from the first day you initiate that proposal, the idea, and how it seeps around at different levels of the government, in the local institution, and how it becomes a global knowledge from day one. So that was the first reflection that I wanted to share with you all. The second one, which is important, is that the research output is a key ingredient that should go into policy making. And there are other ingredients that goes in when it comes to policy making. But in order to make that research effective, we need to have multiple efforts at different levels to ensure that the findings of that research are going to the right audience, to a broader audience, and to share that with the people who are the decision makers and also the people who are affected by those decisions. So at GDN, back in 2011 and 12, and then what we saw is that as a researcher, I was focused more on the research. But as we go along, we were asked to open up Twitter accounts, we were asked to be present on social media, we were asked to write briefs, so a lot of outreach that was done beside that research. And I think that's what made a difference, and that's what knowledge brokers such as GDN can make a difference. And I felt proud of being part of that process of being able to share the knowledge that were made and be able to use that local knowledge that we gathered during the research process and to share it globally and to share it in a way that was being well received. And even so that there was a Harvard Business Review case study done on that particular research, which I also think was part of a process of making the research more popular. So I think these efforts that were done by a knowledge broker and are done by others as well is what makes connects the research world to the policy-making world. But they're not so different. The end goal is the same, is to find a solution, and we just need some players that would fill that gap and make sure that the solution is transferred to the right audience. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is that I started off as a researcher, but then I moved into operations. Now, that transition was initially difficult, but at the same time, I felt in the end there was some benefit out of it because once you become a researcher and your mindset and the way you're processing the information and the way you look at things objectively, of course, when you're on the other side, you also look things objectively, but it's just that when you transfer that knowledge with you. And so I've been part of the UN, the Islamic Development Bank, the IMF, and more recently I'm at the IFC, but I try to always base my decision at the operational level using those sort of research output. And I think that's how individuals can make a difference. So this could be an anecdotal evidence of myself, but I'm sure there are a lot of you in this room that have carried on that research cap that you're wearing in different roles that you play in today's world. And so I think it's a big question to answer, but I want to leave people in this room with 4 recommendations or 4 Ps that I say. The first one is to participate in networks. So if you become part of these networks, you have access to global experts. And being part of those networks allows you to ground your research ideas into reality. You're able to sound those innovative plans or the research plans that you have with people who would tell you what can be done and what couldn't be done. The second P is to pursue. So there's a lot of data out there, right? So we're going through a data revolution. So it is time for us to be bold, to use those big data that's out there and help those to go to the policymakers so that we can make a difference. The other thing that I want to share as well, that when I interacted with policymakers, they believe on research output that needs to be done today. So oftentimes research is a long process, right? So what we need to do, I guess, is to predict the need of the future and to act today. So that's what I mean by the third P, which is P, predict. And the last one is to be practical. So with that, so a policymaker has multiple sources when he or she is making a decision. And research is one of the input to that decision-making process. The idea is not to make it the only source of information, but rather a source of information that is reliable, that is of quality, and that is making a big difference. So with that, I would conclude.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Pierre.
Thank you very much. Well, after a few years at the helm of the organization of GDN and repeated attempts to go to funders and try to get appropriate funding for what we do as a research-based network, I have been led to reflect on this knowledge for development approach that has been developed over the last almost 30 years now, but certainly the last 20 years with, as Joe Stiglitz reminded us, the movement that took place at the World Bank at the time, and then the creation of GDN and so on. And a lot of things have happened. I think, however, that there are deep shortcomings in the current approach. The first one is that when one observes where social science production is located, there is no overwhelming concentration in high-income countries. The figures basically for social sciences and even for development research is that 75 to 80% of the published production takes place in high-income countries. 2% takes place in low-income countries, and about 10 to 12% in higher middle-income countries. Now, as such, this is not necessarily a problem. If one sees knowledge as a disembodied global public good, which it is in many aspects, it benefits everyone wherever it is produced. And there are economies of scale. It is clear that an environment conducive to research benefits researchers, increases their productivity through the synergies and interaction that it proposes, and therefore it makes sense to concentrate factors of production in the same place. Hence, the attractiveness of big universities and campuses. Concentration increases research effectiveness and productivity. So this geographic concentration as such is not a problem. However, it has directed the knowledge for development model. Several of the top universities in high-income countries have nurtured centers of development studies and attracted top students. And there has been a buoyant market, academic market for development research, which has emerged over the years. And knowledge for development was, in that context, understood as part of a sort of integrated process which starts with academic research and through appropriate policy recommendations, research communication and dissemination results in research uptake by policymakers, and again, wherever the research is produced. And then it is applied for better policymaking. In such a model, again, concentration is not a problem. And people will recognize that contextualization is necessary, but it can be achieved by fieldwork. So it means that, again, in such a model, the conception of effective development policies has belonged to development experts and has neglected dimensions related to implementation of such policies. The focus has been on the what and what should be done, and not as much on the how and how it might be done, and how actually it should evolve in order to be able to be done. And that is, for me, one of the major shortcomings in reflecting on the link between research and policy. The real dimension that matters about that link is much more the how than the what. So if one sees the connection between research and policy only as a problem of research communication, explaining the policy recommendations that come from academic research, then one misses a very important part of policy, which is that it is in constant doing rather than in a one-shot applying of given recommendations. So that is something that for me is a very important aspect of the current knowledge for development approach, a lack of focus on the how, and once one decides to focus on the how, one does need local research production, not only as a source of localized, contextualized research production, academic production, but also as a way to intermediate the local knowledge with the foreign produced and often relevant, of course, knowledge. And I commented this morning that this led to a view of research and of research as a way to treat a pathology of a development gap. And that is, for me, a very deep misunderstanding of what the development process is about. The second shortcoming that I have observed is very much linked to that, is that all this reflects a flawed approach in understanding the role of research in policymaking and in society. Of course, academic research has some strong instrumental dimensions. It may be directly useful to understand an issue and even to propose solutions, and probably much more outside social sciences than in social sciences, but even in social sciences. And some of the very focused RCTs, since Joe mentioned the problem of RCTs, indeed can illustrate in some very specific situations a very instrumental approach to action and to policy making. But most of the time, what deeply matters about social science research is the Enlightenment dimension. It is part not only of democracies, but it's part of well-being. access to knowledge is one intrinsic part of well-being. It's not measured directly by GDP or by income, but it's a very important dimension. We need access to knowledge because we are better off with that better understanding. That dimension of research is important in all countries, whatever the level of income. And therefore, an exclusively instrumental view of research misses that. And it goes even further than that, and Joe was kind enough to mention it. The instrumental approach to knowledge transforms the democratic debate into a technocratic debate, into a list of certainties, a deterministic view about policy and what should be done, and that is contrary to democracy, and it's contrary to enlightenment. And that is something that is a danger that we today face, and it is part of the explanation that we could find when looking at the loss of trust right now in many countries, including the most developed one, about expertise and science, which I think is a very, very dangerous movement in our democracy. And finally, and I will end with that, all this has led to an insufficient attention given to capacity building. Capacity building has been seen mainly as a byproduct of research. In order to get a good research paper, we need capacity building, which is fine. I have no disagreement with that, except that I believe that capacity building on research has its own merit. It shouldn't be directed only by the objective to produce a publishable paper. It is the acquisition of methods that are vital to develop a critical mind and an ability to assess knowledge and evidence and existing work in any country. And for that, what doesn't need ultimately to publish a research paper, of course, it's a very valuable academic objective, but the utility of research goes well beyond that aspect. And the point that we are trying to make at GDN is that capacity building should be defined as a process for its own merits and should be defined with its quality control as a self-standing process of building and acquiring methods. There is a lot to work on if we want to achieve that and to convince funders that it is a way to go. And I hope that with all of you, we can build the pressure to be able to do that further. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I hope we have time at the end to discuss some of these ideas, but I expect your guidance in terms of the time. Jerry has been president of universities here in Europe, in Argentina, president of GDN, and I guess is in the best and unique position to answer why sometimes research done at universities does not make it to the policy stage. Argentina is an excellent example. A country that has great researchers, great knowledge, but then the policy actions do not necessarily reflect all that knowledge. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about why it's so difficult to bridge that.
You hear me? Thank you for the question, but I'm not going to answer your question. I'm not going to talk about conceptual issues. I talk about conceptual issues in Argentina, and the national press kills me. So I would say about GDN that I think that GDN has fulfilled in 20 years its mission, and a magnificent mission. Remember that 20 years ago, there was a very different world. The digital revolution was not yet in place. So the networking, the South-South linkages between researchers was a very important fact. Today, it's much easier to have these type of interrelations. So I think that the critical mass, and you can read in the leaflet that GDN has produced of researchers, is really outstanding. So I want to mention, and then I will be more operational, one part of Pierre Jacquet's paper, which says that he talked about the nexus from informed applied research to politics, more than to policy, to politics and civil society. And why? Because I think that the first dialogue that the researcher has to have, or the director of a think tank, is slowly with the politician. After the politician understands the process, becomes eventually the policy. And it is not the reverse, you know. And in general, one has to choose. You have the federal level, the state level, or the municipal level, or the urban economy level. I will start by the lower levels in politics. So what I have learned by being in GDN, that was for me opening my mind when I went back to Argentina, and I will answer a little bit your question. The first of all is that social innovations and interventions are multidisciplinary, as was said here. So you don't have to leave that to economists. And in general, economists are very unsympathetic people for politicians. So you have to create labs in which you have people from different disciplines. Social interventions like in infectious diseases, in education, well, health, let's say in ecology, even in science and technology, are multidisciplinary things. So I think you have to build, in that sense, labs. The other issue I want to say, it's we know that you need to build prototypes which are experimental. So we do not know exactly what economic development, I would say we know. I mean, what are the goals, the normative issues, but what are the ingredients to achieve, I would say, economic developments? Then you need to measure impact. Sometimes it's very difficult to measure impacts, but then you have to lobby with politicians. Why? Because even a mayor of a small city, they don't like impact evaluation. They hate impact evaluation, no? So you have to be, very rhetorical. You have a humid process before applying this. Once you have, let's suppose that the intervention, it's okay. You make a difference, no? You make a difference at the margin. Then you can slowly, convince to have a scaling up of the process, no? in one region. Then also, and you invite other leaders, other governors or mayors from other cities, you invite them to explain why this intervention, for example, early childhood education, was successful. And the second thing that I learned from GDN is that you don't have to fear failure, as Joe was saying. Failure in a prototype is a very important thing, and you have to disseminate why your prototype failed. Because another researcher or another think tank might take this, and have, and have a small difference in your prototype and find, so this is knowledge. The knowledge comes from previous failures also, not only from previous successes. So this is very, very important. Then you need human capital, and the human capital, as in the paper of Pierre was saying, doesn't have to have the level of the frontier, and this type of peer pressure to publish. But you need some things like quantitative skills. It's very important to have quantitative skills, numeracy skills. Big data is starting to become very important because it is a compactor, of information. And then, and this is what Mauricio said, I was a little bit tempted to have your question about increasing fiscal revenues. I think that first, you must know that because we were not successful, it's because there is a lot of waste of money in public expenditures. And not only there is a lot of waste of money in public expenditures, but the way to address those social problems are with means that are obsolete, okay? Are with means that are obsolete. So you have to identify goals, and you will find maybe cheaper ways of intervening. We, in Gates Foundation obtained a cheaper way of intervening in the malaria issue in Africa, for example. But then again, the politician doesn't like that because he has command over an immense budget, millions of dollars of budget. And if you say that he can solve a particular problem with 10% of that budget, I mean, he or she will not like. So you have to convince the politician that this will be a budget relief to solve other social problems. No? Some other intervention must be very expensive. Early childhood education is the most expensive social policy. It's hugely labor intensive. But if you explain the intertemporal effect of early childhood education, and that brings the social rate of return for society is immense. Therefore, it becomes very, very cheap. But again, the politician doesn't like that, because within the political tenure, there is no clear effect. Okay, so that's why politics becomes before policy, and then you have to educate. I mean, this is very important. You have to educate the children, the student, about scientific approaches, about mathematical approaches, and about humanities approaches from the beginning. This will be very important. You have to have prototypes that they learn by playing, discovering, and you have to invest in them having trial and error behavior. This is very, very important, the critical mind of the citizens. Finally, what I want to mean before ending this, the strategy is like a guerrilla warfare strategy. You start with several regions of your country, okay? You start with several regions of your country, obviously with a prototype that works, adapted to the heterogeneity of every region. And then when you have a critical mass of provinces or states, then suddenly it can become a state or public policy. It's bottom-up. It's civil society, bottom-up process. So in that sense, is a metastatic, process, a good metastatic process. So finally, what I recommend GDN is to invite the politicians of the countries you represent to have immersion courses at GDN to explain those issues. We have done at the Fundación Bungiborn, CIPEC, where a representative is here, a think tank of Argentina, does this process of talking first with politicians and then explain the prototype, okay? So these are my view is more operational. Small is beautiful, but then you have to have stamina to replicate that, and the scaling up process is not really a think tank responsibility. It's a government or a state responsibility. So this is a little bit my reflections, thanking Pierre for the invitation, Ramona Angelescu, who's here, Shereen Gonheim, that she was phenomenal in GDNet, where it was a huge innovation, and all the staff of GDN during my tenure. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerry. So I think in a way, you answer the question is start with the micro. You build that bridge with the micro. Mm-hmm. And then you move on to the macro stages. Alan, your experience is just outstanding in academic life, and in this particular case in the board of GDN, where you were chair up until 2 years ago, I believe. Mm-hmm. So why don't you share with us the overall view of this bridge between research and policy, and flavor with the experience of GDN.
Yeah. and all in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So let me first of all start by paying my own tribute to Guillermo Perry, whom we do miss very much. There's been no one who was a greater supporter and contributor to the Global Development Network. Let me also claim I was here in Bonn 20 years ago at the 1999 meeting where we started it all off. So I guess GDN and I go back a long way. And I actually am going to talk about a sort of personal journey from working in development to being engaged with GDN, whose mission and approach I profoundly believed in, working in British government, and then the last 3 years banging my head on the brick wall that is Brexit. I think that my first observation is changing policy requires informed debate. And that's not just a matter of the researcher-policymaker interaction, but you do need a free-ish press. I'm more and more persuaded that a free media is important, a responsible media. There are some bits of social media that don't meet that, perhaps. One needs education. One really does need the ordinary population have at least some grasp of some of the things that are going on. And one needs institutions to manage that. Within our own sort of part of this sphere, what are the requirements? I think there are three important requirements that I would say that reflect back onto the work that GDN has tried to do. The first and most obvious one is you need expert and objective researchers. They need to be technically competent. They need to be able to spot, as it were, things that need to be done. That requires something about individuals. It requires something about incentives that they face. More so now than I thought 10 years ago, or than I realized 10 years ago, they also need a very strong ethical code. And if we do medical education, they spend a lot of time talking about medical ethics. Business schools now tend to have ethical, corporate ethics. I think in sort of research and social science, we actually do need to go back and think about the ethics, the job that the researcher has to play in society. The second thing is one needs an audience. Now, partly that's the public who are generally educated, one hopes. But more than that, one needs a group who are closer to the research but not yet researchers, and this is in many cases officialdom, but maybe think tanks, maybe even people within large private institutions. The point there really is that the audience needs to know what research can do and what it can't do, what you can ask of a researcher and what you can expect to get out. This mismatch of expectations has, I think, been quite a problem for us to handle. One of the other implications, I would say, is it's never wasted to educate people in doing research, even if they don't turn into researchers. If they go out into the private sector, if they go into the press, if they go into officialdom, the fact that they have some concept about how you do it, how you pose a question to a researcher, I think is very useful. Now, getting an audience like that is a very, very long-term process. And it was always a regret for us in the GDN that we couldn't get 20 years' money in one go, as opposed to 20 months if we were really lucky, and often 20 weeks. It's also very expensive. There's going to be a lot of wastage along the way, or a lot of diffusion along the way. And it's also important that we make researchers, as it were, feel confident that they can engage with these people. I constantly say, more so now than I used to perhaps, I do international trade. I'm used to losing 85% of the fights that I get into. Don't blame the researcher if it's not adopted as policy. Politicians have a job to do that is not our job. We do different jobs. As a researcher, we give our best and objective advice. The policymaker, I've never ever, I should say, also in trade, I have never ever come across a problem where the piece of research necessary to answer it was there, completely complete, pat, there's the answer, so just do it. You always need someone to translate, always someone to apply to the set of circumstances. Don't blame the researcher if it's not adopted, as long as it were, he or she has done their job by bringing the evidence, not just their own work, but a view of the whole field. And that's part of the ethical thing. Third thing is this long-term engagement involves trust. It's an issue that's been really borne home to me working in Britain over the last 3.5 years, where the referendum, they said, we've heard too much from experts, where I've moved from being not listened to in policy debates, because in 1999, everybody thought they knew what to do about trade policy, not being relevant, to now being ignored because we're too relevant. We're too close to the bone for the political elites to listen, to run the risk of listening. So what we need to do there is a very, very long-term engagement again, which builds trust, that says, you ask me, you tell me what your problem is, I will tell you what I think I know. I can't answer it, but I will try my best. It's engagement, and we need to bring young researchers to understand that they have to do engagement even when they are struggling most of the time with the technicalities of research. And it's not because it's good for them in some abstract sense, it's because over 10 years, they will gradually win the trust of the audience who ought to be listening.
Well, thank you very much. We have a few minutes for a couple of questions and comments. Let me pose this just to begin. I think most of these interventions have mentioned at one point or another that this is a global public good. The idea of being able to exchange research, to participate in projects that cover different regions of the world, it's a global public good. But yet there is a government failure. It's very hard to fund these activities, and it's very hard to basically make others pay attention to this and participate with funding. And the other idea, which builds a lot on what Alan just said, but Joe Stiglitz also mentioned it, the policy advice production function, to put it in economic terms, is a very complex one. You never know when you're going to need the research that you did. It may be that there's a lag of 10 years, 20 years. You never know. I participated in 2 big research projects sponsored by GDN, one on migrations. This was about 10, 12 years ago. And it's now, the research that was done is now being used in Colombia because we have a problem with 1.2 migrants coming from Venezuela. We never thought we were going to have that problem. But that's when it's becoming interesting, important, relevant. And many times funders want their dividend immediately. It's hard to explain that this is going to take time. Or think, for example, the research that was done at GDN on commodity exporters, the dialogue between the African countries and the Latin American countries that depend on commodities. This was at the years of the boom, the peak years. And I think all of that research became much more relevant 5 years ago when we have these dramatic crisis associated with the declining commodity prices. There are some countries that were well prepared, others were not well prepared, and then they suffered the consequences. So the production function of policy advice and policy implementation is very complex. You never know when the research that you did is going to prove useful. And this is part of the government failure. That's why it's hard sometimes to fund this, because it's not immediate, the effect and the impact you're going to have. So, well, we have time for a couple of questions, comments. You have one comment here, and the lady just in front of me. Maybe if we have time for the third, we'll pick one of those. Wow, sorry. I created expectations. That's the worst. So please.
Thank you, sir, for giving me the opportunity. I just want to mention 4 names, and then I come back to the point that you are trying to make. We cannot expect immediate transmission of this is knowledge, this is where I'm applying. The 4 names I'm going to mention: Amartya Sen, Manmohan Singh, Mahbubul Haq, Rehman Subhan. What's common in them? They all went to Cambridge in the 50s, and they sat at the foot of Joan Robinson and the illustrious professors of Cambridge. Now, what is the consequence? We should look at things positively. Not everything is negative. Look at human development indicators. Look at this whole idea of well-being. Where do these ideas come from? It's this knowledge that was generated, acquired, nurtured in various places, at Harvard, at Cambridge, at JNU, Delhi University, Dhaka University,
Chicago.
IIT, CPT. It doesn't matter. The knowledge gained, the knowledge produced at Cambridge in a very intellectual global environment was then relocated, transferred, and in sociological terms was localized. So now you see, not just in Pakistan, maybe Pakistan is a failure, but this whole idea of human development indicator, I think it's an enormous contribution to knowledge development. So rather than looking at A leads to B, we should look at it in a more discursive historical manner.
Thank you very much. It's not working. Just wait for the microphone.
Yeah. Thank you. You'll also hear me in the next session, Beena Agarwal. So I just wanted to make 2 sorts of points. One is Alan Winter's, just take that forward a bit, that I think it is possible for researchers to wear multiple hats. And good research does produce trust among policymakers. Not always, I mean, politics enters into it. So one can say that if you do research, I think there is incumbent on us, if you're doing development research, that we take it to other forums. So for instance, you can write in the media. I mean, many of us constantly write opinion pieces in national dailies. You can intervene directly in policy making. Now, perhaps India is one of those spaces where you can do that. We used to intervene in the 12th five-year plan with the Niti Aayog. And so it takes time. You don't necessarily get brownie points in your universities, but I do think that that's something that would be part of a broader responsibility. The second is, of course, policy is implemented and made not just by governments, but also civil society. There were huge examples from Bangladesh and South Asia and elsewhere. And often it is much easier for researchers to take that to civil society, who then expand it, elaborate it, and possibly it could get into policy. It's also disaggregated. So, for instance, if you have a federated structure, different state governments may be more open. Some may be more open, for instance, than others to take your ideas forward. So I feel as researchers, we shouldn't just stop at good papers, but take them forward.
That's it.
Just stop. One's very tiny. I think there is a problem here in concentration of knowledge and research in large universities abroad, because if those ideas are not relevant or problematic, they have huge resources to repeat them endlessly. I mean, RCT as the gold standard is a very good example of how enormous resources can make an idea occupy much more space than it would be possible if it came from a developing country.
Sure, and this is a very important point. Let's not forget, this is meant to be the convening force for people that are doing research in universities across the developing and emerging countries. This is useful for the exchange of ideas in universities that up until recently were very isolated. And this is the concept that GDN is promoting. Yes, the gentleman way back in the last row. By the way, before the microphone gets there, your point about other ways of being influential is crucial. Guillermo Perry, whom we are honoring because he should have been chairing this session, wrote every Sunday an op-ed in the main newspaper of Colombia. And he was a tremendously prestigious economist. But that op-ed made him influential because of the things he said every Sunday about the way in which policies were being handled in Colombia. Yes.
Hi, I'm Atal Ahmadzai, and my question is about this. Okay, so the debate is whether there is a disconnect between policy and research, or this nexus of policy and research. What do you think if there is any disconnect between policy research nexus and realities on the grassroots? Or if I can frame my question in another way, how about the nature? When we are saying that good research, what is good research? Based on what criteria we identify a good research? So in that case, like the evidence that is created either by utilitarian model or by RCTs, the evidence that we are saying evidence, how much these evidence are reflecting the realities on the ground.
I think we get the point. I'm very sorry because we're going to have to stop this. Alan, I mean, you're the person with the wisdom and the experience here. What is good research? I guess that's the question. What's good research from the point of view of policy? That's essentially the question. Well, is it research that gets published, or that doesn't matter if it's not published in top journals? You know? But But I think you have, Jerry's saying that he wants to have another word, but...
So good research has to be rigorous, however we define rigor, but we do have standards. The purpose, what we get from publication is some notion that it's been rigorous because it's been reviewed carefully before it goes out, and it's then out to the one audience that can assess its rigor. I also think it needs to be relevant, so it needs to deal not necessarily with an immediate issue with one single policy lever that you can pull, but to contribute and to understand how it is eventually going to contribute to making lives better. Thereafter, it's patience, exactly as Maurizio said, you put it in the drawer, it might not have an audience for a long time, but it's there. So I think I would say it's sort of rigor and relevance are the two things.
Jerry.
Yes, I think that the type of research that you need to address, who is the person who asked? Okay,
right there.
To address is very different because, for example, infectious disease is not only an economic problem, it's not a medical problem, it's a multidisciplinary problem. So you need epidemiologists, economists, demographs, okay, well, I mean, maybe political scientists, educators. So you need to form that in a multi. So I take for granted that all of them are top human capital guys. But I think we have to think, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's taken for granted. It's outside the box. I mean, most of the social problems, most of the things, the ingredients of economic development are not a monopoly of economists. So you have to think at a different way of research, because in the lab, for specificity of every region, you produce the prototype in the think tank, okay? Endogenously, you have the prototype. Of course, you must be trained, you know, as it was said here. Some of them have the lucky being trained in Oxford, in Cambridge, in Chicago, okay? Or in local, for example, in the lab, I take, you know, local researchers, which are top-notch and local researchers. So I don't understand very well the research in a university versus the research in a civil society or an NGO or a foundation to address this. I have my doubts. You have to be trained in university, of course. You have to have, but it's a different way of thinking, which is very difficult. I mean, it's a new way of thinking to address those problems. That's the only comment I have.
Well, thank you. Diane?
One sentence.
One sentence, 30 seconds to conclude. Pierre as well, Conor as well. Final thoughts.
Good research, I think, can be objectively known. And it's one of the responsibilities of the researcher to speak truth to power. But too often, power decides what the truth is.
Anaka?
I think that's very profound and it's hard to follow up. But yes, as we defined today, what is good research? I think as long as each researcher takes accountability of the research they're doing and doing it in the context of the world that we live and be able to predict what may come in the future and cater to that need, that would be qualified research and that would help us move forward.
Thank you. So it's very fitting that the current president of GDN closes this conversation.
Well, I think, thank you. It was a very rich debate. In conclusion, I would just like to comment on the notion of relevance, because there is a sort of contradiction in saying, on the one hand, that one never knows when research will be useful, and at the same time, to require research to be relevant. So I would, the way around for me is to recognize that there are different sorts of useful academic research. The kind of research that GDN is mostly engaged in is what we call policy research. And in policy research, there is this implication that what we do needs to be relevant in a sort of short to medium term. And the way to build relevance for us is to make sure that the definition of the research project itself is discussed with policymakers and with civil society. So in a way, the interaction between the researchers and the policymaker need to take place upstream and not only when the research has been conducted and produced. And this is a way to build relevance into the research program themselves and to also build expectations from the policymakers on that research, which matters a lot to get people interested in the work of researchers.
Great. And just remember that maybe because the restrictions in the formation of human capital in many of our countries, many times the researcher is also the policymaker. It's part of the life cycle.
Congratulations.
So that's an investment. It's an
Congratulations
investment
for
for,
the minister.
in research, it's an investment for policymaking. And I think that's part of the benefits of GDN.
No, I'm not going to be minister in Argentina.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll move on.
Okay, so we are running over time. We are a bit behind schedule. We were scheduled to have a half-an-hour coffee break. I do urge you to come back in maximum 15 minutes with your coffee or tea so we can start the final plenary of the day. So latest, let's resume by 4:15, please. Thank you.